Indonesia, the untold story of a giant nation's birth. In a corner of our world, scattered like a necklace of emeralds across the equator, lies an archipelago of over 17,000 islands. It is a land of superlatives, of volcanoes that touch the heavens, jungles that are home to orangutans and dragons, and reefs that hold the planet's greatest marine biodiversity. Today, we know it as Indonesia, but this nation did not come to be by chance. It was an achievement, a saga forged in fire, diplomacy, and an unrelenting desire for one word: freedom. Our story begins not with a map, but with a scent, the aroma of clove and nutmeg, spices that centuries ago were worth more than gold and lured European navigators to their shores. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, arrived to dominate. For 300 years, Dutch rule spread, uniting this vast archipelago not as a nation, but as a colossal corporate colony, the Dutch East Indies. Society was a rigid pyramid. Europeans at the top and at the bottom, the immense native population. Javanese, Sundanese, Balinese, Batak, hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, all under a single foreign yoke. The colonial system was brutal. Local resistance, like that of Prince Diponegoro in Java, was crushed. However, in the early 20th century, the Dutch themselves made a fatal miscalculation. Through their ethical policy, an attempt to give back to the native population, they offered Western education to create loyal administrators. Instead, they forged revolutionaries. They gave Indonesia's future leaders the language of their oppressors and, with it, the Western ideas of liberty and nationalism. Into this world, in 1901, a boy named Sukarno was born. No one could have known, but the fate of 17,000 islands would one day rest on his shoulders. He would not just witness history, he would become its architect. As Sukarno grew, other brilliant young minds were on paths that would inevitably cross his. Most notably, a studious and pragmatic economist from Sumatra named Mohammad Hatta. If Sukarno was fire, Hatta was reason. One was a charismatic orator, an engineer of souls who could mesmerize crowds with tales of the ancient Majapahit Empire, promising a glorious future. The other was a methodical organizer who, while studying in the Netherlands, obsessed over the economic structure and popular education that must come after freedom. Hatta and his colleagues were the first to insist on the political use of the name Indonesia, transforming a geographical term into a national project. The union and clash between these two titans, the passionate populist and the pragmatic intellectual, would define the soul of the revolution. They were complemented by Sultan Syahrir, a refined socialist who distrusted mass movements and argued for a deeper revolution, one based on education and transforming the people's colonial mindset. One of the most inspired and unifying decisions of this nascent movement was the adoption of a common language. Instead of choosing Javanese, the language of the largest ethnic group, which could have alienated the rest of the archipelago, they adopted Malay, a centuries-old trading language, and rebranded it as Bahasa Indonesia. For the first time, an activist from Sumatra could communicate perfectly with one from Borneo, forging a shared identity that transcended local cultures. With its leaders emerging and its ideas spreading, a direct confrontation was inevitable. Sukarno founded the Indonesian National Party, the PNI, which did not seek to negotiate, but to demand total independence. The Dutch government, sensing the growing threat, decided it was time to silence the revolution's loudest voice. In 1929, the crackdown came. Sukarno was arrested and put on trial in the city of Bandung. The Dutch wanted to make an example of him and crush the movement. Instead, Sukarno gave them a spectacle. He turned the defendant's dock into a pulpit. For 2 days, he did not defend himself. He went on the attack. In his legendary speech, Indonesia Menggugat, Indonesia Accuses, he deconstructed 300 years of colonialism, using Western logic itself to expose imperial exploitation. The verdict was a prison sentence, but the speech became a sacred text for nationalists, read in secret across the islands. Sukarno's imprisonment created a martyr. After his release, he was arrested again in 1933, this time without a trial, and exiled to the remote island of Flores. Far from the crowds, Sukarno reflected deeply on how to unite such a diverse nation. It was in this isolation that he drafted the 5 principles of Pancasila, a belief in one God, humanism, national unity, democracy, and social justice. It was an attempt to find a philosophical soul for Indonesia, a common ground for its Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists. Hatta and Syahrir were also arrested and sent to the most feared prison camp, Boven Digoel, deep in the jungle of New Guinea, a place where malaria was deadlier than the guards. Even there, they refused to yield, organizing classes and keeping the intellectual flame of the movement alive. While Indonesia's leaders were in exile, the world was marching toward war. The Empire of Japan, with its slogan, "Asia for the Asians," presented itself as a liberator from European colonialism. For the nationalists, it was a dangerous and tempting proposition. Should they trade one master for another, or use one to get rid of the first? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. In March 1942, the unthinkable happened. The Japanese army invaded the Dutch East Indies. In just 8 days, 300 years of Dutch rule collapsed. The myth of white supremacy was shattered. The Japanese freed Sukarno and Hatta, bringing them to the capital, Jakarta. The stage was set for the most dramatic act in Indonesia's history, a turning point that would force its leaders to make the most controversial decision of their lives. Sukarno and Hatta made a pragmatic and perilous gamble. They chose to collaborate with the Japanese. They reasoned that open resistance would be suicide. Collaboration, however, could be a tool. The Japanese gave them access to the radio and allowed them to travel the country. Sukarno used this platform with mastery, coding every speech supporting the war effort with messages of Indonesian national pride. Syahrir, on the other hand, went underground, organizing a secret resistance network, convinced that Japanese fascism was just a new form of tyranny. The honeymoon with their Asian elder brothers was short and brutal. The reality of the occupation was horrific. Millions of forced laborers, the Romusha, were sent to die on military projects across Southeast Asia. Famine spread as food was confiscated. Torture by the Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, was common. But amidst this brutality, the Japanese committed another historic irony. Needing troops, they trained and armed tens of thousands of young Indonesian men in a militia called PITA, Defenders of the Homeland. In doing so, they were unknowingly forging the core of the very army that would soon fight for an independent Indonesia. By 1945, with the tide of the war turning against them, the Japanese promised independence. A committee was formed, and it was before this body that Sukarno formally presented his Pancasila philosophy as the foundation for the future state. Then in August, history accelerated dramatically. As Sukarno and Hatta were returning from a meeting with the Japanese High Command, shocking news arrived, picked up by Syahrir's clandestine radios. Atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was on the verge of surrender. A sudden power vacuum opened up. The Japanese were defeated but still armed. The Allies were weeks away. Sukarno and Hatta, ever cautious, wanted to avoid a bloodbath. But the Pemuda, the impatient and radical revolutionary youth, saw hesitation as betrayal. They believed independence should not be a gift from the Japanese, but something taken by force. In the pre-dawn hours of August 16th, the Pemuda acted. They kidnapped Sukarno and Hatta and took them to the small town of Rengasdengklok, away from Japanese influence. There, they pressured their leaders, arguing that the moment was now or never. The pressure worked. Sukarno and Hatta agreed. That same night, back in Jakarta, in the home of a sympathetic Japanese admiral, they drafted the Proclamation of Independence. The text was short, direct, and powerful. The declaration was written, but words on paper do not create a nation. The morning of August 17th, 1945, a small crowd gathered in front of Sukarno's house in Jakarta. At 10 a.m., Sukarno, fighting a malarial fever, read the proclamation. A flag, hand-sewn the night before from a white sheet and a bolt of red cloth, was raised on a bamboo pole. The Sangsaka Merah Putih, the sacred red and white, ascended into the sky. The Republic of Indonesia was born. The news spread like wildfire. Merdeka was painted on walls and train cars. But the euphoria was short-lived. British troops arrived on behalf of the Allies, tasked with disarming the Japanese and returning power to the Dutch, who were close behind, determined to reclaim their colony. The confrontation was immediate and brutal. The Indonesian National Revolution had begun, a 4-year war. On one side, the Republic's fledgling army, armed with captured rifles and sharpened bamboo spears, the iconic bamboo runsing. On the other, the professional British and Dutch forces. The Battle of Surabaya in November 1945 was the Republic's baptism by fire. The British expected to crush the city in 3 days. Instead, the Indonesians fought fiercely for 3 weeks. The city was destroyed, but the desperate resistance proved to the world that the Republic was real and willing to die for its freedom. The slogan, Merdeka atau mati, freedom or death, became a bloody reality. The struggle unfolded on 2 fronts, military and diplomatic, while guerrillas, led by the legendary General Sudirman, who commanded his troops from a litter in the jungle even while dying of tuberculosis, fought in the countryside. Politicians fought on the world stage. Sharir and Hatta pleaded Indonesia's case at the United Nations, seeking international support. Sukarno remained as Bung Karno, Brother Karno, the unifying symbol whose voice on the radio inspired millions to keep fighting. This struggle was sustained by the spirit of gotong royong, or mutual cooperation, as entire villages supported the fighters. It was fueled by the resilience of a people who refused to break, and by a belief in unity in diversity, which bound hundreds of ethnic groups under a single red and white flag. In 1948, the Dutch captured the revolutionary capital, Yogyakarta, and arrested Sukarno and Hatta. It looked like the end. But the resistance in the jungle continued, and the leaders' capture sparked international outrage. Pressure from the United States on the Netherlands became unbearable. The war was growing too costly and unpopular. Forced to the negotiating table, the Dutch and Indonesians met at The Hague. The Hague Round Table Conference in 1949 was the climax. The war was now fought with words and clauses. The Dutch tried to impose a weak federal state and forced Indonesia to assume the massive colonial debt. It was a bitter compromise. But Hatta, leading the Indonesian delegation, secured the main prize, sovereignty. On December 27, 1949, in Jakarta, the Dutch flag was lowered for the last time. As the red and white flag of Indonesia was raised over the presidential palace, a crowd of 1 million people erupted in a unified roar of joy. Merdeka! Sukarno returned to Jakarta in triumph. The fight was over, but the challenges were just beginning. The nation was in ruins, the economy shattered, and the internal divisions that had been set aside during the war re-emerged. The leadership duet of Sukarno and Hatta began to fray. The saga of Indonesia's emergence is a testament to the power of an idea. It is the story of how 17,000 islands were united by a shared dream of freedom. The nation they built remains, to this day, a complex tapestry of contradictions, vibrant, chaotic, deeply spiritual, and stubbornly pragmatic. The legacy of the Founding Fathers is as complex as the nation they created. The partnership of Sukarno and Hatta eventually broke. Sukarno grew increasingly authoritarian until he was overthrown in the 1960s, paving the way for the long regime of General Suharto. Suharto's fall in 1998, Indonesia finally embarked on a democratic journey. Today, it is a vibrant regional power, yet the questions its founders wrestled with, of identity, justice, and unity, continue to shape its destiny. The story of Indonesia's birth is not a relic. It is a living prologue whose struggle for Merdeka continues in the hearts of its people.
Subscribe to the Vault of Chronicles channel. Stories you've never heard, every day here.